The arrival at Blackwood Academy. Nathaniel Graves had never feared silence until he arrived at Blackwood Academy. The carriage rattled through the dense fog that clung to the countryside, the horses' hooves muffled against the damp earth. The road was long, winding, and too quiet, as if the trees themselves were listening, waiting. Nathaniel clutched his suitcase, his fingers tightening around the worn leather handle. His father's parting words echoed in his mind. "You'll be a fine scholar, Nathaniel. Just keep your head down and your mind sharp." Blackwood loomed ahead, its Gothic towers stabbing into the sky, its windows dark and watchful. The academy was ancient, older than the town itself, with a reputation that balanced precariously between prestige and something unspoken. Nathaniel had heard the whispers. Blackwood is cursed. The students vanish. The walls have ears. He had dismissed them. Until now. As the carriage slowed before the wrought iron gates, Nathaniel felt it, a deep, unsettling weight pressing against his chest. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Like something inside the school was expecting him. The warning Nathaniel stepped out onto the cobbled courtyard, the air heavy with mist. Other boys bustled around, their uniforms crisp, their voices hushed. The headmaster, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, greeted him with an unreadable expression. But it was Thomas MacLeod, a lanky boy with sharp features and a thick Scottish accent, who approached him first. "You're the new one," he muttered, stuffing his hands into his pockets. "Listen close, Graves. There's one rule you need to remember." Nathaniel arched a brow. "What's that?" Thomas glanced around before whispering, "Never ask about the Latin teacher." Nathaniel felt the chill settle in his bones. Before he could question further, the massive iron doors of the academy swung open with a deep, groaning creak. Nathaniel stepped inside, and the doors slammed shut behind him. Mr. Sampson arrives. The dormitories were vast, with towering ceilings and dark wooden floors that creaked beneath every step. Nathaniel was shown to his room, a sparse chamber with a narrow bed, a desk, and a single frosted window that wouldn't open. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it. Not footsteps, not voices. A scratching sound, software slow, deliberate. It came from inside the walls. Nathaniel turned to Thomas in the neighboring bed. "Do you hear that?" Thomas was staring at the ceiling, his expression rigid with fear. "It's him," he whispered. Before Nathaniel could ask what he meant, the scratching stopped. A silence thicker than the air itself filled the room. And then, the door to their dorm creaked open. Nathaniel sat up, his pulse hammering. A tall, shadowed figure stood in the doorway. The new Latin teacher, Mr. Sampson. His black eyes gleamed like polished onyx, and his lips curled in something that should have been a smile but wasn't. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat, because when Mr. Sampson turned his gaze on him, Nathaniel realized he wasn't blinking, and worse, he wasn't breathing. The teacher's lips parted, and in a voice like cracked parchment he said, "Tomorrow you will learn about memory." And then, as silently as he had come, he was gone. Nathaniel lay awake for hours. Outside his window the yew trees rustled, and from somewhere deep beneath the school something whispered back, the cursed Latin lesson. Nathaniel barely slept. The shadows in his room stretched unnaturally against the walls, shifting whenever he looked away. The air felt thick, like the room itself was holding its breath. The scratching in the walls had stopped, but that only made it worse, because now he could hear the whispers. Faint, muted, as if they were coming from under the floorboards. But morning came, and with it the strange unease of Blackwood Academy faded just enough to make him doubt himself. Until Latin class began. The sentence that shouldn't exist. The students sat in silence as Mr. Sampson entered the classroom. His black robes barely rustled as he moved, his presence unnatural, his shadow long and twisted against the stone walls. His fingers, long, too long, rested on the desk as he scanned the room, his eyes settling on each boy as if measuring their worth. Then, without preamble, he spoke. "Today you will write about memory." The students hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. "One sentence," Sampson continued, "in Latin, about something remembered." Nathaniel gripped his quill, dipping it into the ink pot. He thought of home, of his father's parting words, of the heavy fog that clung to the academy's towers. Then, a whisper, not from the other students, not from the teacher, but inside his own ear. Memento pute inter quatuor taxos. The words came unbidden, pressing against his mind like a breath of air from somewhere deep underground. Nathaniel shuddered. He didn't recognize the phrase, but his fingers moved on their own, scrawling the Latin words onto the parchment. Remember the well among the 4 yew trees. The moment his quill lifted from the page, the air in the room changed. A cold breath of wind swept through the classroom, though the windows were shut. A faint rattling sound echoed from somewhere unseen, like bones clinking together in the walls. Mr. Sampson moved toward him. Nathaniel swallowed, his pulse spiking as the teacher loomed over his desk, his shadow swallowing the candlelight. Sampson's eyes fell on the words. His entire body stiffened. For the first time, the teacher's expression changed. His lips pressed together, and his grip on the desk tightened. The tendons in his hands strained against his pale skin, and for a moment, just a moment, Nathaniel saw something flicker in those dead black eyes. Fear. Then, without warning, Sampson seized the parchment. His fingers clenched around the paper so tightly that it ripped in half. Nathaniel flinched, his breath catching. The other students turned, watching in stunned silence. Sampson held the torn paper, his shoulders rising and falling as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Then, in a slow, controlled movement, he placed the halves of the parchment in his desk drawer. Without looking at Nathaniel, he spoke. Class dismissed. No one moved. Mr. Sampson's head snapped toward the students. Leave. Chairs scraped against the stone floor. The students rushed to gather their things, murmuring nervously as they filed out. Nathaniel hesitated. For a split second, he thought he saw something moving beneath Sampson's robes, a flicker of black tendrils writhing just beneath the fabric. Then he felt it. Something watching him. Not Sampson, something else. Something outside. Nathaniel turned toward the window, his breath hitching. Through the frost-covered glass, he could see the 4 ancient yew trees swaying in the wind. And beyond them, a figure was digging. The teacher at the well. Nathaniel barely remembered getting to his dormitory. His mind buzzed with questions, warnings, and something deeper. Something clawing at his thoughts. That phrase, where had it come from? Memento pute inter quatuor taxos. He had never heard it before, never studied it. Yet he had written it perfectly, and Mr. Sampson had reacted. He glanced toward Thomas, who had been watching him since they left the classroom. "MacLeod," Nathaniel said under his breath, "do you know what it means?" Thomas hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he replied, "I think you just made a very dangerous mistake." Nathaniel's stomach twisted. That night, neither of them spoke. But at midnight, Thomas shook him awake. "Nathaniel," he hissed, his voice tight with fear. Nathaniel blinked groggily. "What?" Thomas gestured toward the window. "Look." Nathaniel turned his head, and his blood ran cold. Out in the courtyard, where the 4 yew trees stood tall and ancient, a shadow was moving. Not a student, not a staff member. It was Mr. Sampson. And he was digging. His hands moved methodically, shoveling dirt into the night. His back was unnaturally straight, his movements too smooth, too precise, like a puppet being guided by unseen strings. Nathaniel's breath shallowed. A sudden wind swept through the trees, rustling the leaves. And then Sampson stopped. Slowly, rigidly, he lifted his head. Nathaniel's blood turned to ice. Sampson was staring directly at their window. Nathaniel couldn't move, couldn't blink. Sampson's mouth moved. No words, just a slow, silent smile. Then, from beneath the ground, a hand reached up from the soil. Nathaniel clamped a hand over his own mouth to keep from screaming. The hand was thin, skeletal, covered in rotten flesh. It grasped at Sampson's wrist. Sampson didn't flinch. Instead, he helped pull it out. Nathaniel grabbed Thomas's arm, his pulse hammering. "We have to leave," he whispered. Thomas nodded, his face white with terror. Then, as they turned toward the door, a piece of red-stained paper lay on Nathaniel's desk. A note, written in his own handwriting. "If you don't come to me, I will come to you." Nathaniel had never written those words. The wind outside howled, and beneath the yew trees something was climbing out of the well. The vanishing shadow. Nathaniel could not breathe. The room felt smaller, the air too thick, pressing against his ribs like unseen hands. He and Thomas stood frozen, staring at the red-inked note that had appeared on Nathaniel's desk. "If you don't come to me, I will come to you." His own handwriting, but he had never written it. Outside, through the frost-covered glass of the dormitory window, something moved beneath the yew trees. Not Mr. Sampson, not a teacher, not a student. Something else, something wrong. Nathaniel could not see its face, but he knew. It was looking for him. The watcher in the courtyard. "MacLeod," Nathaniel whispered. "Are you seeing this?" Thomas nodded, but his face had gone pale, his lips slightly parted in horror. Because now the shadow wasn't alone. There were others. Figures drifting between the trees, moving in a way that no living thing should. Their heads tilted, their limbs slightly delayed, as if their bodies weren't fully attached to their movements. Nathaniel's pulse thundered in his ears. Then, a sound. Not from outside, from the hallway, a soft, deliberate knock against the dormitory door. Nathaniel and Thomas whipped around, their breath catching. Another knock, slow, rhythmic. Then, from beyond the wood, a whisper. "Graves, open the door." Nathaniel jerked backward, his stomach twisting. The voice was familiar, but it wasn't quite right. It was too thin, stretched in a way that made the words feel unnatural, like an echo in an empty room. Thomas grabbed his wrist. His hand was shaking. "Don't," he mouthed. Nathaniel wasn't planning to. Instead, he reached for the candle on his nightstand, raising it slightly, as if a dim flame could protect them from whatever was outside. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then a shadow pooled under the door. It spread slowly, inching forward, seeping into the wooden floorboards like spilled ink. Nathaniel's breath hitched. Something was on the other side, and it wasn't human. The dormitory window. Nathaniel turned to Thomas, panic rising. "We need to leave." Thomas nodded, but before they could move, a scream tore through the hallways. Not a normal scream, not from a student. Something worse. It was raw, jagged, like the sound of bone scraping against stone. Nathaniel's entire body went cold. The candle flickered wildly in his hands. The inked note on his desk, the one that had appeared on its own, was gone. But before he could process that, Thomas grabbed his sleeve and yanked him toward the window. Nathaniel stumbled forward. "MacLeod, what are you—" "Look," Thomas hissed. Nathaniel did, and he felt his stomach drop. In the courtyard, directly beneath the 4 yew trees, someone was standing. Not one of the shadowed figures, not something strange. It was Mr. Sampson. Nathaniel froze, but something was wrong. The Latin teacher was staring up at their window. His neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes black as the abyss. His lips parted, revealing too many teeth. Then, very slowly, his body lifted off the ground. Nathaniel's breath caught. His grip on the candle tightened. "MacLeod," he whispered, "we need to leave." Thomas didn't respond. Nathaniel turned, and his stomach dropped. Thomas's eyes were wide, locked onto something inside the room, something behind Nathaniel. Nathaniel turned just in time to see the dormitory door creak open. The hallway beyond was empty, but the shadows beneath the door were still there. And from the doorway, a hand stretched into the room. Long, too long, fingers bent in the wrong direction. A voice, thin and echoing, slithered through the air. "Come outside, Graves." Nathaniel threw the candle. The flame hit the floor near the door, and the shadow recoiled violently, retreating like smoke caught in the wind. The door slammed shut. Thomas grabbed his arm. "What was that?" Nathaniel's breath was ragged. "We need to—" Then a low, breathy exhale came from the window. They turned, and Mr. Sampson was inside the room. The silent teacher Nathaniel couldn't move, couldn't think. Mr. Sampson stood between them and the door, his mouth stretched into a smile, his head tilting in a way that no human head should. He hadn't come through the door, hadn't climbed through the window. He was just there. Nathaniel's hands trembled. "Sir," Thomas whispered. What are you doing?" Mr. Sampson's lips parted, his expression unchanging. Then he spoke. But the words didn't come from his mouth, they came from inside the walls. "If you don't come to me, I will come to you." Nathaniel shoved Thomas backward. "Run!" Thomas bolted for the door. Nathaniel followed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the teacher didn't move. But his shadow did. It lunged forward, stretching unnaturally fast, slamming into the walls, into the ceiling, filling the room like a tide of darkness. Nathaniel threw open the door. He and Thomas raced down the hallway, their footsteps echoing wildly. They didn't stop, not until they reached the stairwell, not until they slammed the heavy door behind them, not until they heard the whispering stop. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas whispered, "What was that?" Nathaniel turned, his pulse still hammering. "I don't think Mr. Sampson is human." Thomas's face went pale. Then a new sound. Not whispering, not scratching. A slow, deliberate knock. Not on the door behind them, not from the hallway. From above. They both turned their heads upward. The ceiling was breathing. The forbidden well. Nathaniel could not look away. The ceiling expanded and contracted, moving in slow, deliberate motions, as if something was breathing just beyond the plaster. The wood groaned under the unseen weight, the candlelight flickering as shadows slithered through the cracks. The knocking came again, software rhythmic, and then a whisper from inside the walls. "Memento pute inter quatuor taxos." Remember the well among the 4 yew trees. Nathaniel's stomach turned to ice. Thomas was already backing away, his face pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Graves," he whispered, "we can't stay here." Nathaniel tore his gaze away from the ceiling, nodding wordlessly. They turned and ran. The gardener's warning. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the academy grounds. The wind howled through the trees, the old yew branches swaying violently, their twisted shapes clawing at the sky. The air smelled of damp earth and something older, something rotting beneath the soil. And there, in the center of the trees, stood the well. Nathaniel's heart slammed against his ribs. The stones were ancient, cracked with time, but something had disturbed them recently. The ground around the well had been dug up. Mr. Sampson had been here. Nathaniel took a slow, hesitant step forward. The well was deeper than it should have been, its mouth a dark abyss, stretching into something that felt endless. Thomas muttered a prayer in Gaelic, shifting nervously. "We shouldn't be here," he hissed. "We shouldn't even be saying its name." Nathaniel turned to him. "What are you talking about?" Thomas's jaw tensed, but before he could answer, a voice from behind them made them both jump. "You boys have no business near that well." Nathaniel spun around. The school gardener stood at the tree line, his weathered face lined with deep creases. His clothes were caked in mud, his hands stained with something darker. His eyes were locked on the well. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "What is this place?" The gardener's gaze flickered toward him. A mistake. A gust of wind rushed through the yew trees, sending a spray of dead leaves through the air. The sound that followed wasn't the wind. It was a whispering chorus. Too many voices speaking at once. The gardener's face hardened. "That well should never have been uncovered," he said. "It was sealed for a reason." Thomas exhaled sharply. "Who sealed it?" The old man's fingers twitched. "The last boys who were foolish enough to look inside." Nathaniel felt his blood go cold. The wind howled again, the trees creaked, and from deep within the well, something moved. The hand in the darkness. Nathaniel didn't realize he was stepping forward until it was too late. The darkness pulled at him, not physically, but something worse, something in his mind, urging him to look. To remember. His hands trembled as he gripped the rough stone edge, leaning slightly over. The smell of damp earth and old decay hit him instantly. Thomas hissed, "Graves, don't—" But Nathaniel was already lowering the lantern into the abyss. The light swayed against the cold stone walls, illuminating something far below. Not water, not empty space, bones. Nathaniel's stomach twisted violently. Human bones, dozens of them, tangled together like discarded dolls, their skulls cracked, their spines contorted, and then a hand rose from the darkness, a thin skeletal hand, its fingers stretching toward the light. Nathaniel choked on a breath. The lantern flickered. The hand moved. Thomas yanked him backward. and from inside the well a voice whispered, "I will come to you." The opened grave. Nathaniel stumbled away, his heartbeat thundering. The whisper didn't stop. It curled through the air like smoke, threading through the trees, wrapping around them. The gardener's face was ashen. "You need to leave," he growled. "Now." Nathaniel barely registered the words. His eyes were locked on the well. The hand had disappeared. But something else had taken its place. A pair of black eyes stared up from the depths. Not human. Not alive. Then, the whisper turned into a scream. Nathaniel and Thomas ran. They didn't stop, didn't turn back, didn't even dare breathe until they were back inside the school walls, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them. But Nathaniel's hands wouldn't stop shaking because he knew they hadn't closed the well, and whatever was inside, it wasn't done with them. The night watcher. Nathaniel sat upright in bed, unable to sleep. Thomas was restless too, tossing and turning, mumbling in his sleep. The whispering had stopped, but something else had taken its place. Nathaniel felt it before he saw it. A presence. Watching. His breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the window. His pulse stopped, because Mr. Sampson was outside, standing beneath the yew trees. His body was stiff, unnaturally still, his neck tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes, his black, empty eyes, were locked directly onto Nathaniel. Nathaniel's hands gripped the sheets, his mouth went dry. Then Mr. Sampson moved, not walked, not stepped, just shifted forward, too fast, too smooth. Nathaniel gasped, and then the scratching began again. Not from the walls, not from outside, from under the floorboards. The whispering returned. "If you don't come to me, I will come to you." Nathaniel choked on a scream. Something shifted beneath his bed, and then from directly behind him, a voice too close to his ear. "Graves." Nathaniel turned, and the last thing he saw before everything went black was a hand reaching out from the shadows. The disappearance of Mr. Sampson Nathaniel's scream never made it past his throat. The hand that had reached from the shadows was gone, vanishing the instant his eyes locked onto it. The whispering, the scratching beneath the floorboards, all of it had stopped. But something remained. A feeling, like the room wasn't empty, like something was still watching. Thomas sat up with a gasp, his eyes wide, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "Did you hear that?" Nathaniel didn't answer. He was already moving, pulling back the sheets, checking the floor beneath his bed. His hands trembled as he lifted the wooden panel, heart hammering in his chest. Nothing. The space beneath the floorboards was empty. No footprints, no disturbed dust. But he knew something had been there, and it wasn't finished with him yet. Mr. Sampson is gone. The next morning, Blackwood Academy felt different. The halls were too quiet, the teachers spoke in hushed tones, the students avoided eye contact. But no one would say why. Nathaniel and Thomas exchanged glances as they entered the classroom, their unease growing. The desks were lined up neatly, the chalkboard was blank, but there was no teacher. Mr. Sampson never arrived. Minutes passed, then an hour. Finally, the headmaster entered, his expression unreadable. His eyes swept the room before settling on the students. "There will be no Latin class today," he said. "No explanation, no further details." Then, before he turned to leave, he added something that made Nathaniel's stomach twist. Mr. Sampson never existed. A silence fell over the room. The students stiffened. Nathaniel felt Thomas tense beside him. "What?" Nathaniel opened his mouth to speak, to argue, to insist that they had all seen him, all spoken to him, all been in his class. But no one said anything. The headmaster's cold, unblinking stare lingered for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked away, leaving behind only silence. The gold coin. That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep. Something was wrong. No one had spoken about Sampson's disappearance, not a single student. It was like they had all been conditioned to forget. But he wouldn't forget. He couldn't. He had seen Mr. Sampson standing beneath the yew trees. He had seen the hand reach up from the well. Something had happened, and he needed proof. He sat up, running a hand through his hair. The candle beside his bed flickered. The wind outside moaned against the window panes. Then, A sharp clinking sound. Nathaniel froze. He turned slowly, his heart pounding. And there, on his nightstand, was something that hadn't been there before. A gold coin. Nathaniel's breath hitched. He reached out, hesitating for only a moment before picking it up. The surface was smooth, old, its edges worn down by time. And then he saw the engraving. GWS, 24th July, 1865. Nathaniel's chest tightened, his fingers clenched around the coin. GWS, Gideon W. Sampson. He wasn't just the teacher, he had been a student. Nathaniel's pulse spiked. He turned to wake Thomas. But Thomas was already sitting up, his face drained of color. His wide, terrified eyes were locked on the window. Nathaniel followed his gaze, and the air left his lungs. The thing at the window. Outside, in the moonlit courtyard, something stood beneath the yew trees. Not a shadow, not one of the figures from before. This time it was Sampson. But it wasn't him. Nathaniel's stomach twisted violently. His limbs felt numb. Because Mr. Sampson's face was stretched, his mouth pulled into an unnatural smile that didn't belong to a human. His teeth were too many. His eyes were black voids. And as Nathaniel watched in frozen horror, Sampson lifted a single skeletal hand and tapped against the window. Nathaniel jerked backward. The glass shuddered, rattling beneath Sampson's touch. The smile widened, the mouth splitting at the seams, stretching too far. Then, the scratching returned, not just at the window, under the floorboards, in the walls. Nathaniel and Thomas sprang from their beds. The whispers surged, an unnatural, inhuman chorus filling the room, vibrating through the walls, echoing inside their skulls. The candle flickered wildly, and then a voice, not from outside, not from Sampson, from inside the room. Memento puttae. Nathaniel spun around and saw the red-stained paper on his desk, the note that had disappeared before. Only now the words had changed. Too late. I have come to you. The window shattered. A hand lunged through the broken glass. Nathaniel grabbed Thomas, yanking him away. They barely made it to the door before the floorboards burst open, blackened skeletal fingers clawing out from beneath. The dormitory lights died. The whispering became screaming. Nathaniel slammed the door behind them, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Thomas was shaking violently. "Nathaniel," he rasped. Nathaniel turned. "What?" Thomas lifted a trembling hand, pointing at something behind him. Nathaniel slowly turned and froze. The floor was covered in dust, but leading away from his bed were wet footprints, and they didn't belong to him. The thing in the classroom. Nathaniel could hear something breathing. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, inside the walls. Not outside, not under the floorboards, but all around them. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse hammering as he and Thomas stood frozen in the hallway. The door to their dormitory was still shaking, the shattered glass from the window glinting in the moonlight. And those wet footprints, the ones that weren't theirs, led down the corridor, disappearing into the dark. Nathaniel swallowed hard. "We need to get to the headmaster," he whispered. Thomas didn't answer. His eyes were still locked on the footprints, his face pale, his hands shaking. "Nathaniel." His voice was barely above a breath. "What if there is no headmaster?" Nathaniel's stomach twisted. He grabbed Thomas by the sleeve and pulled him forward, away from the dorm, away from whatever had tried to come through the window. The school felt wrong, the air thicker, the corridors longer than they should have been. And the whispers. Oh God, the whispers, they followed, software breathless, repeating the same Latin phrase over and over. Memento puttae. Memento puttae. Remember the well. Nathaniel clenched his jaw. Number he wouldn't listen, he wouldn't let it in. The only light came from the scattered oil lamps mounted on the stone walls, their flames flickering violently as they passed. And then, as they turned the corner, Nathaniel stopped so fast Thomas nearly ran into him, because the classroom door was open. The shadow that didn't belong Latin class. The room was dimly lit, the long wooden desks still lined up in perfect order. The chalkboard was clean. The air smelled of dust and ink, and in the center of the room, a man stood with his back to them. Nathaniel stiffened. Thomas let out a strangled breath. Samson? Nathaniel wasn't sure. The figure was motionless, his black robes hanging loosely over his frame. But something was off. His shadow, it didn't match. The oil lamps cast long, flickering shapes across the walls, and yet the figure's shadow was wrong. It wasn't attached to his feet, it stretched in the opposite direction. Nathaniel felt sick. "Sir," he called, though every instinct screamed at him to run. The figure didn't move. Nathaniel took a step forward, then another, then the classroom door slammed shut behind them. Thomas yelped, spinning toward it, rattling the handle. "It's locked!" Nathaniel's breath came sharp, his pulse a war drum in his ears. He turned back to the figure, his heart screaming. But the figure was gone. There was nothing in the center of the classroom anymore, just his shadow. Still on the wall, still moving. Nathaniel's mouth went dry, the shadow tilted its head, and then it stepped forward. Nathaniel grabbed Thomas, stumbling backward, his vision tunneling in panic. The shadow peeled away from the wall, rising, its limbs stretching, elongating, its black shape rippling like liquid. Its eyes opened. Not eyes, empty holes, black pits where its face should have been. And then, the desks began to move. The classroom awakens. The wooden desks scraped against the floor, shifting without being touched. The books stacked neatly along the shelves tumbled to the ground, pages fluttering open. Nathaniel's eyes widened in horror. The pages weren't blank, they were writing themselves, line after line of red ink, the words appearing from nowhere, etched into the parchment by an unseen hand. Nathaniel forced himself to read, "Memento pute inter quatuor taxos." If you don't come to me, I will come to you. Too late, I have come to you. Nathaniel staggered backward. The chalk lifted itself from the blackboard, moving with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of it scratching against the slate was too loud, too jagged, like bone scraping against stone. Then, the message finished, and the chalk snapped in half. Nathaniel and Thomas stared at the words. A single bloody handprint had appeared beneath the writing, and above it, "I never left." A low exhale filled the air. Nathaniel turned his head just in time to see something crawling out from behind the teacher's desk. It wasn't human, its limbs bent in the wrong places, its fingers too long, its teeth visible even when its mouth was shut. Its empty eyes locked onto him. Nathaniel couldn't move. It smiled. Then, the oil lamps shattered. The vanishing teacher. The room erupted into darkness. Nathaniel felt something brush against his arm. He recoiled violently, grabbing Thomas. "Run!" They bolted for the door, but it still wouldn't open. Then, a sharp, ragged scream tore through the classroom. Not from them, not from the thing behind them, from the chalkboard. Nathaniel turned. The words had changed again. No longer a message. Now, a name. G.W. Samson. Nathaniel's breath hitched. The door burst open on its own. They stumbled into the hallway, gasping, trembling, the air outside feeling almost too light. The whispering stopped. The desks were still, the books were silent. Nathaniel turned back. The classroom was empty. The shadow was gone. Mr. Samson's desk was gone. As if he had never been there. Nathaniel swallowed the rising panic. Then, a single drop of ink splattered onto the floor. The whispering returned, and a new message appeared on the chalkboard. The well is open. The final entry, what should not exist. Nathaniel's legs barely carried him down the corridor. The words on the chalkboard, "The well is open," burned into his mind. The oil lamps in the hallway flickered violently, their flames twisting, shuddering, suffocating, as if the very air around them was thick with something unseen. Beside him, Thomas gasped for breath, his hands trembling violently. "Nathaniel." His voice was barely a whisper. Nathaniel turned. Thomas was staring at the floor. A wet footprint had appeared at the end of the hallway. Then another, and another, leading toward them. Nathaniel's blood turned to ice. Then, from somewhere close, a sound broke through the silence. A whisper, but not just one, dozens. Moving, shifting, crawling against the walls. "Memento pute." Remember the well. Nathaniel grabbed Thomas's arm. "We have to leave." Thomas didn't argue. They ran. The courtyard, the well has opened. The wind howled through the academy grounds. The 4 ancient yew trees swayed violently, their branches clawing at the sky like twisted fingers. The ground was wet, soaked in something darker than rain. And there, at the center of the trees, the well was open. The stones that had once sealed it were scattered, as if something had pushed them aside from below. The air reeked of damp earth and something else, something rotting. Nathaniel's chest tightened. He knew it was coming. Then a sound, a deep hollow breath, not from him, not from Thomas, from inside the well. Nathaniel took a step back. Thomas. But Thomas wasn't looking at the well. His eyes were fixed on the other side of the courtyard. Nathaniel turned his head, and his pulse stopped. Mr. Sampson was standing there, but he wasn't standing. He was floating. His black robes hung motionless, his head tilted unnaturally, his lips curled into a too-wide grin. And his eyes, empty voids, were locked directly onto Nathaniel. Nathaniel's stomach lurched violently. Then Sampson moved, not walking, not stepping, just shifting forward. Nathaniel stumbled back. "Stay away." Sampson smiled wider. Then he spoke. "I have come to you." Nathaniel's knees nearly buckled. The whispering intensified, growing louder, circling them. The well trembled, the ground cracked, and then a hand reached out. From the depths of the well, a skeletal hand clawed at the stones, pulling itself upward. Then another, and another, and another. Nathaniel couldn't move. The thing wasn't just one body, it was many. Their arms woven together, their faces contorted, eyes black pits, mouths open in silent screams. Thomas screamed. The entity rose higher. The wind howled. The whispering became one deafening voice. "You opened the well." Then the academy bell rang, and everything stopped. The missing pages. Nathaniel gasped. The whispering vanished. The well was sealed again. The ground was undisturbed. The yew trees stood still. Mr. Sampson was gone, and the only proof that any of it had happened was the gold coin in Nathaniel's pocket. Thomas fell to his knees, shaking violently. Nathaniel forced himself to look toward the well one last time. A single red-stained piece of paper lay beside it. A page from a diary. Nathaniel bent down, hands trembling, and picked it up. The ink was still wet. It was written in his own handwriting. "If you don't come to me, I will come to you." Nathaniel's breath caught, because he hadn't written that. Then the page burned to ash in his hands. The epilogue, "The school remains." Years later, Blackwood Academy stood untouched. The story of Mr. Sampson had faded into nothing. The well was never found. The records of Nathaniel Graves and Thomas MacLeod ceased to exist. But sometimes, on cold nights, students wake to hear whispering. Not from the walls, not from the floorboards, from the old Latin classroom. And when the desks shift, when the chalk writes messages on its own, the same phrase always appears. "The well is open. He has come to you." The end.